Hello, welcome back to our second panel
on U.S. China engagement on trade, technology, and climate change. This panel is going to be chaired by Dr. Liu Yawei, Director of China Program at Carter Center. Dr. Liu is also a key member of ICAS Advisory Board and has written substantially on a lot of U.S. China relations and facilitating a lot of online discussion. Dr. Liu and Denis very kind to fly from their cities to join us today. Dr. Liu, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's nice to be in DC when the Summit for Democracy is now being held, as we speak. And since the pandemic, I've never been here, so it's a great opportunity to be here, at the U.S. Capitol, where a lot of decisions are being made about the relationship, a lot of debate that happens about the relationship. So as Dr. Hong mentioned, this panel is about engagement or disengagement of trade, technology, and investment. And we have a great lineup of speakers. I'm not going to spend too much time reading the bios of each of the speakers. So we'll just follow the order that's in the agenda. So first, we're going to have Ashton, Vice President of U.S. China Business Council, soon to move to New York, right, to work at the Institute of Policy at Asia Society. So, Anna, you go first.
Okay, thank you. I'm not moving to New York. I'll be in the DC office, but I am going to be departing the U.S. China Business Council in a few weeks. So I wanted to kick off by giving some thoughts on the state of the U.S. China trade relationship, the commercial relationship. Despite the tension, many U.S. companies continue to thrive and find value in the business relationship with China. The U.S. China Business Council represents more than 260 companies, U.S. companies that do business with China. And like many of our sister organizations, we conduct an annual survey of our members to gauge the business climate there. 95% of respondents to our 2021 survey told us that they remain profitable, and 43% said they plan to increase resource commitments in China over the next year. China is a critical market for virtually all companies with international business. Our companies tell us that to be competitive globally, they must be able to participate and compete in the China marketplace. A lot of what makes China important for business these days is not, as many Americans suppose, the opportunity to leverage cheap labor. I'm not saying this wasn't once the case. It was, but China's economy has developed considerably in the past couple of decades. Most of the country is not characterized by those developing market conditions, such as cheap labor, that persist in the popular imagination when Americans think and talk about China here. Our companies tell us that competing in the China market is like competing in other major developed markets around the world. Competition is fierce, success is hard won, and profit margins are slim. Most of our member companies are primarily in China for China, as they say. Their China operations are, in other words, heavily oriented towards serving China's enormous domestic market. China's middle class is now more than twice the size of the entire population of the United States. And before the end of this decade, the Chinese middle class is projected to account for about a quarter of the global middle class, making it overwhelmingly the single most significant driver of global demand for goods and services. Despite the troubles in our relationship and despite the pandemic, US trade with China has also continued to thrive. China remains our third largest trading partner globally, behind only Canada and Mexico. And although the administration has emphasized China's shortfalls in meeting its phase one purchase commitments, the fact remains that China granted many tariff exemptions over the course of the last year in order to meet those commitments, and sales have been significant, a boon to the industries to which those commitments applied. Our members remain relatively upbeat about prospects for the commercial relationship to thrive, but their optimism is also moderating. They note a variety of concerns with China operating environment, which I will touch on briefly in a moment, but most notably and most stark is their concern about the state of the bilateral political relationship. Every year, we ask our member companies to rank the top 10 challenges that they face doing business in China. And for the past 4 years running, our member companies have ranked the U.S.-China bilateral relationship as their #1 challenge. This stands out because the top issues our companies generally identify or identified in surveys prior to 2018 were business operational ones, not political risk. The U.S.-China relationship never registered in the top 10 at all before 2018. Companies increasingly, though, are confronting irreconcilable dilemmas linked to conflicting pressures from both governments, and this is exacerbating the uncertainty and political risk involved in doing business there. 45% of our respondents said that they have felt pressure to make statements about political issues, and that pressure comes from both the US and Chinese governments, as well as consumers in both markets who have starkly different views on some of the highest profile issues. A few other challenges born of this political dynamic. A top reported business impact of bilateral tensions to date has been lost sales due to customer uncertainty over the reliability of sourcing via US companies and the possibility of disruptions to supplies. This predates the pandemic. Nearly half of our member company respondents have indicated that lost sales are a problem. This reflects a concern that we really saw begin to pick up in 2019 as tensions and tariffs intensified. Prior to that, it was never a major issue. While roughly a quarter of companies haven't altered their China business strategy due to the impacts of US-China trade tensions, many others have had to adapt. Some of these adaptations include implementing a more localized approach to supply chains, production, services, and intellectual property, while shifting away from certain industry or customer segments in China. Restricted travel between the United States and China, while largely driven by COVID, also seems potentially tied to the broader political frictions between our two governments. Due to China's strict COVID-19 control measures, it remains extremely difficult to obtain visas to travel to China, even for critical business matters. And of course, travelers that do manage to obtain a visa are required to endure long quarantines. These restrictions may be necessary from a public health standpoint, but they've led to operational challenges for US companies doing business there. For example, it's forced them to cancel events, delay significant business decisions, and forgo business opportunities because executives weren't able to be present. The restrictions have also likely exacerbated political tensions between the countries due to a corresponding lack of dialogue and people-to-people exchange. Other challenges are more clearly tied to China's domestic policy. We definitely are hearing that an uneven playing field increasingly makes it difficult for US companies to thrive in the China market. State support for Chinese companies and regulatory barriers disproportionately affecting foreign businesses continue to skew the playing field. And this is particularly true as China becomes a more mature market and competition intensifies politically. Longstanding challenges related to industrial policy, data and cybersecurity policy, intellectual property, and standards are also exacerbated by bilateral tensions. China has not yet applied, but has promulgated a number of laws that could be used to target US companies in response to US government actions. And there are also operational uncertainties born of the various crackdowns on different business sectors that seem to be tied to Xi Jinping's Common Prosperity campaign. But there are also serious obstacles and challenges to the business relationship that are the product of policies here at home. First and foremost, as David Firestein pointed out, the tariffs. The Section 301 tariffs and retaliatory tariffs put in place over the last several years have continued to disproportionately cause economic harm to US businesses, as well as farmers and workers and consumers here. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that tariffs would cost the average American household nearly $1,300 in 2020 alone. American importers have paid over $110 billion in Section 301 China tariffs since their inception, about 40 billion or more of which has been assessed during this administration. These costs, compounded by other inflationary pressures, impose a significant burden on American businesses. We would agree with Secretary Yellen's statement earlier this fall that tariffs tend to increase domestic prices and raise costs to consumers and businesses due to higher cost inputs, and that lowering US and Chinese tariffs would not only help US companies, it would help to ease inflation. But the administration doesn't seem to be working towards removal of Section 301 tariffs, even though most of them extend well beyond the scope of the original Section 301 investigation. Despite the strong bilateral trade numbers for 2020, and despite the administration's commitment to enforcing the purchase agreements in phase one, it's also crucial to remember that the phase one purchase commitments are expiring at the end of this year. And it's unclear whether China is going to maintain the tariff exclusions that it granted in order to meet those commitments. Absent the full removal of tariffs by both sides, it's unlikely that US exports to China will maintain momentum over the long term. One of the biggest problems with purchase agreements is that they're temporary. They also work against market forces. Rather than purchases being fueled by market demand, they're responsive to these government-to-government commitments. That means there aren't necessarily market forces in place beyond the purchase agreements to keep these purchases going when the agreements expire. Without the purchase agreements in place, China would be getting a larger percentage of various agricultural and other goods from other partners. And that means the purchase agreements have also been creating trade diversions. That hurts our trade relationships with other countries, and what we get in exchange for that damage is just the temporary upswing in goods exports that we can't count on being sustained. When we negotiate purchase agreements rather than negotiating things like increased market access and market openings, which are things that we've been asking the administration to focus on, we don't create the conditions for market forces to propel purchases in the future. Additional issues with the purchase agreements as poor measures for creating sustained economic growth vis-a-vis China is that it only covers some US products, not all of them. It creates conditions where the government is essentially picking winners and losers by deciding which products are going to be the subject of these purchase agreements. And that's not consistent with American traditions focused on free trade and fair competition. The tension in the US China bilateral relationship has also fed into latent distrust of the business community, and that distrust is getting worse, and it's keeping pace with the worsening of the bilateral relationship. The business community is frequently and increasingly blamed and scapegoated for problems in the relationship, as well as problems in China and problems here at home. And we're seeing that in this enormous upswing of proposals on the Hill from both parties that are China related. So we have 330 plus China related bills and resolutions that have been proposed in this Congress since January. We had 550 or more bills and resolutions that had a China focus in the last Congress. And none of these are constructive proposals from the perspective of trying to stabilize and improve the relationship. They are provocative, defensive, and oftentimes misguided because they are not built on a firm understanding of the actual conditions of the business relationship. Instability and distrust increasingly seem to be defining the relationship these days. Michael Swain highlighted the distrust and accompanying uncertainties that exist around geostrategic issues and the relationship, and that same distrust and uncertainty is mounting in the commercial relationship as well. Michael noted that neither side currently poses an existential threat to the other, but that neither side is doing enough to engage the other in substantive and meaningful dialogue either. And we would absolutely agree with that at the U.S. China Business Council. While we are encouraged that there has been more dialogue in recent months, there needs to be far more than exists today for us to get back to a place where we can address some of the misunderstanding and challenges in the relationship and begin to feel like we can predict each other's behavior more reliably. Minister Xu Shuiyuan this morning called for greater cooperation on the trade front, and the business community would agree with that. Trade has long been called a ballast of the relationship, and our commercial ties should be seen as a tool for stabilizing the relationship, but they're not being used that way right now. As Robert Sutter noted, we're more and more entrenched in a paradigm that treats the economic relationship as a zero-sum rivalry. The Biden administration has characterized that relationship as defined by these 3 C's: cooperation, competition, and confrontation. But in the Biden-Xi meeting last month, competition was what our side reportedly really emphasized. And on the Hill and in the media, we are most frequently hearing about the potential for confrontation. The commercial relationship really is an arena where there remains great potential for cooperation, which is the 1 C in the list of the 3 C's that we truly need more of. And I will end my intro remarks there.
Thanks, Anna, for that remarks. And we're going to go to our second speaker, Professor Teng, who is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University. Teng, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and also thank you, ICAS, for inviting me to be a part of this great panel and discussion. I would like to start to argue that everyone agree that China and the US has the necessity to cooperate on the issues of climate change, not only because of China and the US are the top two greenhouse gas emitters, accounting for about 40% of global emissions, but also China and the US are the two largest powerhouse for advanced technology to resolve those issues. So we are not the problem, but also the solution. And also China and the US has a very good record to cooperate together to lead the world to identify the solution. This has been proved by the close relationship before the Paris Agreement during the Obama administration. And those joint announcements between China and the US has been approved a major incentives for the global to work together and to make the Paris Agreement happens. And also that we also see this in the just past the COP26 in UK, that China and US with the leadership under John Kerry and also Min Xie to have this joint announcement at both April and during the COP26, and to translate this COP26 as another success. And secondly, I would like to argue that we have already those joint announcements between China and US to identify the possible areas for US and China to work together, but we need to go further. If we look at the joint announcement at this year, April, most of that announcement is generally about the information communication and dialogue between two countries. But if we compare those April joint announcement with the November announcement in the COP26, we could see that there is advancement from information exchange towards more concrete and practical cooperation, and especially both sides identified areas for technology cooperation by understanding that technology is one of the most important toolbox we could have to resolve this global climate challenge. But if we want to make this cooperation on climate change further, and also maybe translate that into a leverage to reestablish or to promote our cooperation in other areas, we need to a very careful design of our cooperation framework on the climate change, and especially on technology part. I would like to argue, firstly, we need to carefully select the areas we can work together because of, although there is a lot of common interest in China and US to work on the climate change, but also there also could be potential risk for this kind of cooperation. And especially if we look at those high-tech market value that which is about $1.6 trillion at year 2016, and US produce about 30% of that, and China produce about 20% of that. So China and the US are also competitors in those markets. And I think that firstly, that China and the US can work on those emerging technologies, which is still not mature in the commercial market, but has a potential to contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gas together in the future. The IEA analysis shows about 50% of mitigation technologies, which is consistent with 1.5 degree pathway, which is simply is not available in the commercial market. So we need to work together and to accelerate the technology development to move the whole world towards the Paris Agreement temperature goals. And one example for those emerging technology where China and the US can work together is the negative emission technology, which including carbon capture and storage, and also the direct air capture technology, and also biomass plus CCS. China and US has very little competition potential in those areas, but if we can work together, we can share the large amount of benefit from those technology. And also that in the recent announcement, we also highlight the areas for cooperation on methane, which is short-lived greenhouse gases, contribute about 1/3 of global warming, but has short-term potential for mitigation. And for China, that most of those methane came from coal mine, and for US, most of those methane came from oil and gas, and also livestock sectors. So I believe that China and the US has potential to work together to identify the technology solutions and to help both of us to reduce those short-lived greenhouse gases, and also to lead the world towards more ambitious mitigation actions. And by seeing that, I also think that we should establish a more robust and continuous institution which can facilitate the cooperation between China and US on climate change issues. In the November joint announcement, we all agree that to establish a working group on climate change. We have that working group in the area of Obama administration, but that working group was stopped during the Trump administration. And it's very great to see that we have those working group back and to establish a channel for both of us to communicate. But also we need to establish a more practical cooperation institution, such as the previous Clean Energy Research Center, which is an institution that to organize the academic and industry partners from China and US to work on specific climate change related project. That has been proved a success with a smart design to manage the IPR issues, which is a key for the cooperation at business level. And I think we can continue that practice to move the cooperation on climate change forward. And also we need to enhance the cooperation at state level, which will be much more robust to the possible future instability at national level of United States. If the change of the central government may shift the attitudes towards climate change, but if we have those connection at local level, then that cooperation could be more sustained and more continuous. So by seeing that, I think that we could cooperate together on climate change, and those issues has potential to cultivate good wills, and that good wills will help us, China and the US, through the difficult geopolitical tensions, and to leverage our cooperation in other areas. I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Teng, for giving us some hopeful expectation that U.S. and China can collaborate in this area. So now we're going to turn to our third speaker, my good friend Denis, who, like me, is a senior advisor to the president on China for Duke University. He came back from China a year ago.
About a year ago,
and now he's charting new waters to see if U.S. China can cooperate in an area where a lot of people say that there is going to be no hope for U.S. and China to cooperate. That's the area of innovation. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks ICAS for having me and inviting me to what has so far has been a really exciting program. Just as a comment from the outset, I couldn't agree more with Professor Tong-Fei. I know former Minister Wang Gang of MOST believed that the CERT program among U.S.-China S&T cooperation was one of the most successful areas, and always said that the model for CERT cooperation ought to serve as the model for other areas of cooperation between the two countries. So maybe we can go back to CERT and see what can be done, particularly because of the IPR cooperation that was worked out. Very complex, but nonetheless worked out. Well, I'm going to make about 5 or 6 points about cooperation in science and technology and education, and hopefully they can give us some idea of a roadmap of where we might go into the future. And I just would raise at the outset a general point. This week, in fact, 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was an editorial by Graham Allison and Eric Schmidt, former founder of Google, about a report that Harvard had just produced. And in that report, it was suggested that in 5 or 6 major technological areas, China had either already caught up with the United States or might in fact even surpass the United States in the future. And one wonders, in a sense, what will happen if in fact the predictions, or at least the suggestions made in that Harvard report, were to come to fruition and the United States was engaged in radical decoupling with China at a time when access and connectivity with China would prove to be very, very important. So I start out with the notion that there is a big risk on the horizon if we don't figure out how to work more collaboratively and more cooperatively with China. So we know for the past 40 years or so, science and technology as well as educational exchanges have been one of the bedrock elements of the bilateral relationship. Even during times of political difficulty, cooperation in science and technology and education continued to go forward, even with the bumps associated with June 4th, 1989. In about a year after that, we again started to regain momentum in terms of cooperation. The only area that had been left out was space. And there have been extensive linkages across both societies involving multiple segments of the economy and society in both countries that have been engaged in this cooperation. The second point I want to make is that if you look at the evolution of this cooperation, it started off through a series of bilateral government-to-government agreements, some of them umbrella agreements, covering many of the departments in the U.S. government, as well as counterpart agencies in the Chinese government, and government was the catalyst that helped kickstart all of this. But as we've seen the evolution of this, 2 things have happened. First, the involvement of the public sector and private sector has far expanded what most people could have imagined to be possible when this relationship got started. In fact, it has gotten not only broader but also deeper in a number of areas, and no one really planned for the relationship to become as extensive as it has become. And like in a number of other areas, the level of interdependence in terms of science, technology, education is much larger than we plan to manage into the future, and therefore we have to take stock of the fact that we may be on a pathway to having to reconfigure and restructure how we work together, because simply the circumstances under which this relationship started have fundamentally changed. Third, I want to say something that is obvious, but I think it needs to be said, that we were on the road to a continuous win-win situation. Yes, there were bumps. Yes, there were some issues, but we continued to find ways to work around them. But unfortunately, at the tail end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration, all of a sudden, big questions began to arise, particularly from Congress and later on from the administration itself, about China's intentions, China's behavior, and China's motivations regarding all sorts of activities in these two bilateral cooperative areas. And in particular, people raised questions about the activities of Chinese scholars and students coming to the United States, and all sorts of accusations were thrown out on the table. Accusations about alleged theft of IP, rising cases of industrial espionage, growing numbers of instances of cyber hacking, and even forced technology transfer that was imposed, at least again in some cases, on U.S. companies as they sought to get access to the attractive Chinese marketplace. So I think that we saw all of a sudden just almost a 180-degree turn from where we were, for example, in the early to mid-2000s to what happened around the period of 2015 and 2016. I would say that over the last 5 or 6 years, therefore, what has happened is China has become viewed as a rising threat to once, was a very asymmetrical, very hierarchical relationship, has turned into one now of greater parity and more balanced capability. And because of that, most people have found themselves almost in a kind of period of technological surprise. Most people could not have believed that the Chinese reforms and changes going on within China, the returnees who came back from education abroad, could have had such a fundamental impact that over the last 5 or 6 years, China has made such substantial progress. Now, I'm not saying all of those assumptions are correct, but I think they are important to take into account. And I would make the argument as my fourth point that the framework and the agreements that were supporting the first 4 decades of this cooperation now have become increasingly obsolete and almost irrelevant, if not outdated. China is now much more capable in both economic terms and technological terms. It now spends almost 2.5% on R&D, and that will grow to about 2.8%. It accounts for 23% of the world's R&D spending. The U.S. accounts for 25%. It's a major source of patents, not all of which are useful, but a number. It's involved in academic productivity in terms of production of refereed articles in top-tier journals, and it's the source of many, many new entrepreneurial ventures, both in the United States and in China itself. So once upon a time, the S&T relationship and educational exchange, I would say, was almost fully insulated from the vicissitudes of the political relationship between the two countries. But now somehow they have become the central focus in terms of the tensions and the mistrust that exist between China and America. And that has left a lot of problems on the table. American and Chinese scientists and engineers, scholars, university administrators, and corporate executives are all caught in the middle of a kind of downward spiral. This is happening while, as we've heard, particularly from Michael Swain, as he said, numerous global problems that are related to science and technology have gone unattended and unaddressed. So let me make my 2 last points then. First, I would argue that there is no major science and technology related global problem whose meaningful solution will not require close U.S.-China collaboration. It's just not going to happen if the two countries don't find a way how to work together. Moreover, given these significant improvements in China's capabilities, for the first time, the idea of mutual benefit and reciprocity actually has some serious meaning. In other words, we were in a game of, again, asymmetry and hierarchy, where the movement of knowledge was almost one direction, and now we're at the point where actually we can fully benefit from our collaboration and cooperation for China. Isn't it ironic that at this point in time, This is the time that we're talking about words like delinking, decoupling, and basically extricating ourselves from those relationships when they can prove to be the most valuable. In fact, if there's one word that I would say and that's most important, it's the word access. There is now no more important time for the United States and China to maintain access to each other's societies and to each other's scientific and educational communities, because this is where the foundations will be built to solve the world's problems. Both countries need to move in that kind of direction, which means that we may need to renegotiate and re-establish new working agreements that will guide us forward for the next 40 years, because the ones that are already in place simply are no longer able to do the job. Now let me make one more point which I think is very important. The common assumption that we make about China, because we talk all the time about the rise of China, is that China is more self-confident and more assertive, and we see a stronger, more capable China out there. But I would argue that there's also another side to the Chinese leadership that is also very important. And that is the side that is filled with great anxiety and apprehension about the future. Chinese leaders realize that the pace of technological change is speeding up, that innovation is accelerating, that product life cycles are becoming shorter, and that trans-border collaboration is actually the name of the game in this new world of globalization in the 21st century. They clearly understand China missed the first industrial revolution. It only caught the tail end of the second industrial revolution. It sort of got some momentum in the third industrial revolution, and now we are in the fourth industrial revolution. China does not only want to miss this for the obvious economic benefits, it also understands there's tremendous political stakes involved if China does not catch the edge of this fourth industrial revolution. So for both countries, we have reached a time where the idea of decoupling on both ends of the Pacific is simply a boneheaded idea, that the risks of disengagement far exceed the risk of continuing to work together with one another, particularly if we develop a new and more workable management structure. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Denis, for that warning that decoupling between the two countries is only going to lead to disaster, to catastrophe. Now we're going to go to our last speaker, Paul Triolo, who is the head of the newest division of Eurasia Group, Geo-Technology. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. So, yeah, I think the tech sector that I want to talk about, sort of the main area of confrontation, one could argue. So I think Anna talked about sort of competition. Dr. Teng talked about areas of potential collaboration, and then the third leg of the Biden administration's characterization of the relationship, confrontation, is really, in many cases, mostly about technology, I would argue. And here, I think the decoupling scenario that the paradigm that Denis raised, may also be sort of a decoupling between the government, in this case, the U.S. government, and the technology sector, which does not support, by and large, decoupling from China, as Anna, I believe, also touched on. So, I'm frequently on panels where the discussion around China and tech issues ends up happening at a very high level. The panelists, nobody actually mentions specific technology companies, and the talk is very generally about AI and semiconductors, these complicated sectors, which, as though these are discrete technologies rather than complicated global supply chains and value chains that involve companies in China and elsewhere, and organizations and collaboration on many levels. I started covering China issues in 1988 when trying to make a telephone call between Beijing and Xi'an, where I was going to be teaching. And at the time, of course, the idea that China would become a technology power was not really anywhere on the radar. Although China's success in things like nuclear and missile technology, certainly everyone knew that China would eventually become a power in these areas. So I think it's important to step back from the sort of day-to-day stuff that I end up dealing with about entity lists and unreliable entity lists and export controls and interpreting data laws, and talk a little bit about how we got to the point where technology is like a zero-sum game with China, right? I mean, that's, again, when 30 years ago, that was sort of completely unthinkable. So I think there are two very complex forces at work here in the relationship. On the one hand is what we've talked about at length here, I think in the morning and the first panel, also some very great comments by Susan Thornton and Michael Swain. I think it was a great panel. David Firestein, I loved all those comments. And it's this sort of situation where the US and the broader Western democracies, the relationship with China obviously has become much more complex. And this consensus has emerged that in the Xi era, Xi has taken China in a direction away from things like market reforms, towards more state intervention in the economy, towards military modernization as a huge priority, and towards efforts to dominate technology sectors via a host of initiatives. So we've seen in the Xi era, of course, all of these major sort of high-profile programs, some of which China has stepped back from a little bit in terms of stressing in public, things like Made in China 2025, the National Semiconductor Investment Fund, the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, and the Digital Silk Road, and major national strategies like the National AI Strategy that came out in 2017. And then, of course, sort of overlaid with this idea of military civilian fusion or integration, which of course China claims is modeled on the U.S. Model. So in all these areas, these programs, the Made in China 2025 is really about Industry 4.0, and of course China claims that is modeled on Germany's Industry 4.0. So in any case, the emergence of all of these plans, coupled with sort of the more difficult political situation, has sort of raised this idea of technology to the fore. And at the same time, the other major trend is that during Xi's tenure, it coincides with huge technology sector developments. So the emergence of AI is a huge player, AI-enabled applications. Semiconductors sort of rising to the fore. Everybody now gets it that semiconductors are, of course, a key fundamental foundation of the technology sector, and now of whole economies, of course. And then things like quantum computing and 5G. All of these issues have sort of arisen during this time when U.S.-China relations were getting very difficult. So after an rather intense 10 to 15 years of collaboration and growing dependence between companies in the US and China in the technology space, which has seen things like supply chains and value chains become very closely intertwined, and with mutual dependence growing across these areas, and also branching into things like financial markets. Now all of a sudden technology it has become the strategic commodity, and is being viewed more and more as a zero-sum game in terms of competition. In addition, we've also seen this during the same period, this exponential rise of data, of the amount of data generated, and it as becoming sort of the most important commodity. After people have compared it to oil, I think that might be you can argue whether that's a flawed analogy, but certainly data has come to the fore, and economies and business models, et cetera, are more and more dependent on data flows, cross-border data flows, and leveraging all manner of data for business operations and innovation. So the coming together of these two things has resulted in the generation of two really strong memes that I think account for where we are on U.S.-China in the technology domain. First, there's a sense that the U.S., which has heretofore dominated X technology sector, right? Name the technology sector you're interested in, that now faces challenges from China and Chinese firms in that technology sector. And given Beijing's focus and large subsidies and lots of people and talent, et cetera, that China intends to dominate those sectors. And again, we can argue over whether that's the right way to view this. I would argue it's probably not. We saw, as Denis mentioned, this editorial by Eric Schmidt and Graham Allison this week, which I think crystallized this sort of what I think is really a mistaken way to view the problem. that article was saying China's going to dominate in all these sectors, right? But if you look at the detail of the sectors, it's really, I think, most of those forecasts are just wrong. If you look at just simply semiconductors, China and Chinese companies are already, despite the National IC investment plan and hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies, Chinese companies are further behind the U.S. in terms of the advanced nodes. So instead of being 2 generations behind, now they're 5 generations behind, depending on how you spin that. And there's no viable path to catching up at this point, because the U.S. In part because the U.S. has cut off the access to some of the most advanced tools for Chinese companies. So to say that China somehow in 10 years is going to dominate semiconductors is just flies in the face of sort of physical reality, because it's just not possible based on technology, based on personnel, based on market conditions, et cetera. So that kind of editorial coming out, I think, is really sort of feeds into this meme that that somehow China, it's a zero-sum game. China wins, U.S. loses, right? When in fact, that semiconductor sector is extremely global. There's lots of collaboration. Chinese companies play a big role. The real question is, what role should Chinese companies play in these sectors, given the different natures of the economic systems and the political realities? How do we get to a point where the U.S. can accommodate some number of Chinese companies, for example, manufacturing semiconductors at cutting edge nodes? The discussion almost never gets to that point, because the assumption is the U.S. should and do everything it can to continue to dominate those sectors. So I think that and I wrote an article on this for China 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, basically saying we shouldn't be treating China as a technology superpower, because it's not. Because if you look at sector by sector, U.S. and other companies in many cases are the leaders. China's catching up in some areas. Chinese companies are gaining capabilities. But to say that that China is a technology superpower now is certainly is one of those areas where I think the policy community, if you're going to build policies based on that assumption, then you're going to probably be on precarious ground. Because the example of Huawei is a good example, where when Huawei and ZTE were put on the entity list, pretty quickly it was apparent how dependent those companies were on U.S.-based supply chains. ZTE alone was using more than 250 U.S. suppliers. So to say that China was independent, for example, in 5G technology, it was simply again missing the underlying nature of the supply chains in that sector. And then second, I think the other meme out there is around data that I mentioned earlier. So data is becoming the new oil, and there's a growing sense in Western democracies, and probably this will be a discussion today at the Summit for Democracy, that and I've heard this in European capitals from senior officials, that the idea that we can't let data, the lifeblood of Western civilization, flow over equipment that is where the company that manufactures the equipment is headquartered in the country that has an illiberal regime. So linking sort of the political system of where in the country where equipment is manufactured. Now this is interesting, because this goes against the U.S. telling China just the opposite for decades, basically saying it shouldn't matter where the equipment is made. Because of course China has also pursued policies to exclude Western companies' equipment from certain networks in China. So that issue goes both ways. But I think the other broader meme that has grown up as a result of some of these dynamics is that China has not lived up to its trade commitments, and it's leveraging U.S. technology and access to U.S. and other Western technologies to bolster military modernization and surveillance. So of course today we saw the story in the Financial Times about yet another Chinese company, SenseTime, likely being added to one of the many lists that the U.S. maintains on Chinese companies. In this case, the so-called non-SDN China Military Industrial Complex list, because of support to organizations in Xinjiang that may be involved in surveillance. So I think that meme that China is misusing these advanced technology in ways that are inimical to Western democracies is a theme that is in many ways driving a lot of U.S. actions. Obviously, today that was the case, and this sense time action will probably be announced tomorrow by the Treasury Department. And then, of course, we have a series of Chinese companies added to the entity list over support for China's military modernization. So we had earlier this year, we had Phytium, a Chinese CPU company, added to the entity list. And this is an interesting case here because this gets to some of the core issues here. Phytium was added because some of the CPUs it manufactures in Taiwan, by the way, at TSMC, were being used in high-performance computing systems that were apparently used to model the reentry of the hypersonic glide field vehicle that China recently tested in August, and other weapon systems. And so now, again, the use of U.S. technology to manufacture semiconductors on behalf of a company that's supporting China's military is a huge issue, and that's in the last year and a half, 2 years. This has become a huge dynamic. And then this has also drawn Taiwan, of course, squarely into the game, and contributed to some of those earlier issues that were discussed around Taiwan and the concerns that Michael and Susan expressed about the instability of the relationship related to Taiwan. Because if the U.S. is going to, for example, force Taiwan further into the blue supply chain and cut off access of Chinese companies to manufacture and use Taiwan as a manufacturing base, then we're pushing up against what I call, I would argue, are unknown red lines on a sensitive issue like Taiwan, and technology, of course, then is sort of front and center. So as we look forward, again, I think the narrative on tech issues is dominated by these two major memes. China wants to dominate X-tech sector and will misuse this dominance. And the U.S. must at all costs maintain dominance of X technology to maintain military dominance and technology leadership. So those are really tough memes to sort of to unpack and try to examine how useful they are going forward. And so if we look for areas where, for cooperation, I think it's really tough. I'm part of a track 2 dialogue on the digital economy with my Chinese counterparts over the last year and a half with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And we've been grappling with these issues. We've been grappling with export controls and, should export controls be limited? And how do you deal with issues like data and other areas that are really tough issues to get into. I think what's really striking is that there are no dialogues at the government level on any of these tough technology issues. And getting back to Anna's discussions around trade, of course, U.S. businesses are keen for some of the issues that were pushed to phase 2 of the trade agreement, market access, and things like subsidies to be taken up again, because these remain issues that are critical. But I think the trade, the downside or the lack of discussion in the trade agreement around these issues that companies all around the world care about, like data, is really striking. That there are no high level negotiations between U.S. and China around data issues, which are critical to the future of the digital economy. So in these track 2 dialogues, we've been frustrated to try to come up with areas of collaboration. So looking ahead, I would make just the following quick recommendations. One, I would say it's necessary to raise what I would call the technology IQ of government officials, particularly in the U.S. Semiconductors are a good example here, where semiconductors are complicated global supply chains, and intervening in those supply chains is tricky. One industry view is that the recent global chip shortage, for example, at least 15 to 20%, maybe more, was caused specifically by just the U.S. action against Huawei, because it disrupted sort of the procurement processes of businesses looking at the chip sector, and they stockpiled semiconductors, and that rippled through the system. So that's an example where, if governments are going to intervene in the technology space, they need to have a really granular understanding of how those global supply and value chains work. Another example is during the trade talks at USTR. The talks in phase 2, getting towards phase 2 issues, started talking about things like complicated, like cloud services, and started to get into areas like data. But the U.S. negotiators didn't really understand the Chinese system and how many licenses that were required for example, to have a viable cloud services business in China. One of our clients, we worked with them. They had to actually assist USTR in understanding the complexities around the Chinese regulatory system. And of course, that's the kind of thing that would have benefited from a much broader all of government effort on the U.S. side to really come to grips with how to press China and for example, to reduce the JV requirement around cloud services and licensing regime. Those are issues that U.S. companies still care about, of course, but now we're it seems very far away to get back to that kind of serious negotiation, because as many of the speakers have said, we've dug such a big hole. I would recommend establishing a dialogue around things like export controls and narrowing them. For example, in our Track 2 dialogue, we've talked about excluding consumer electronics, et cetera, from this. Why should, what's the national security issue around consumer electronics, for example? So there are areas there that could be discussed around narrowing the definition of national security when it comes to things like semiconductors and other other ICT technologies. And of course, I would argue for returning to serious trade negotiations, but expanding them to tackle not only the issues in phase 2, but issues like data and cross-border data flows. These are huge issues. I would establish a dialogue around things like CPTPP. Even somebody as senior as Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell has said that China's bid to join CPTPP is serious. And that's a huge, again, this is something that countries in Asia that are eager to have the digital economy work better for everybody are really intent on. They would like to see, like Singapore and Malaysia would like to see both the US and China in CPTPP, because that would be good for everybody and good for the future of the digital economy in Asia. And so that's an area where I don't see any sign, of course, that the US is eager to do that, but China has sort of forced the issue by beginning at least to the application for an accession process. And then finally, my recommendation would be to dial down the rhetoric around making it technology and these different technology domains zero-sum games, and this harping on whether the U.S. is lagging behind China or the China's ahead in these different areas. This again obscures the underlying reality in those technology domains that companies that I deal with on a day-to-day basis are grappling with, is that Chinese companies are big players in these areas, and in many cases there's no one winner of AI, right? The AI race. AI is going to be eventually like electricity. So it's like saying there's going to be an arms race over electricity. AI is going to be used to enable many applications across business operations and industries. And so to say that China is winning the AI race or the US is winning really is not the way the business community looks at these kinds of technology issues. So let me stop there, because I covered a lot of ground and certainly happen to take questions on anything I mentioned here. And thank you for the opportunity to contribute to what I think has been a really, really excellent dialogue on these issues.
Thanks, Paul. So finally, in DC, we have someone who says, at least in one area, the rise of China is questionable. I wonder, if you're called on to testify in Congress, how are you going to confront, those members of Congress who are going to say, oh, you're out of your mind to say that China is not dominant. But because of the time constraint, I think I'll go one round, asking each panelist to answer questions that are pouring in. So first, for Anna, there are quite a few questions for you. So number one is, what's the trade relationship between U.S. and China after what you mentioned, the phase 1 trade agreement expires? To what extent China is going to fulfill its commitment? So that's one question. The second is posed by one of the audience, is the delisting of the Chinese companies. Will that happen very soon in the next couple of years? And the third question is on what Paul mentioned, CPTPP. U.S. talk about Indo-China economic arrangement. To what extent that is connected to what Catherine Tai talked about, recoupling, or this is actually designed to decouple with China? So Anna, be aware of the time constraint. So we have 3 other panelists to go to.
I'll try to be quick. Let's see. So starting with the the
Phase one.
CPTPP,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess the CPTPP question, and what to make of this news that there may be some sort of Indo-Pacific economic framework that the Biden administration is going to pursue next year. We heard that separately from both Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai after their trips to the Asia Pacific region around the same time that President Biden and President Xi met. I will say first, we don't really know what they're envisioning there because they have yet to share those details. And we're certainly waiting with interest to learn more about those details, but they're not out there yet. Second, we also know that this is instead of considering any sort of path towards rejoining CPTPP. It's very clear that the Biden administration is not aiming for that as one of its trade goals. We also know that the Biden administration has not sought reauthorization of Trade Promotion Authority from Congress, which expired last summer and which is critical for any president to be able to negotiate trade agreements and then get them through Congress. Because if you don't have Trade Promotion Authority, then when you take your agreement to Congress, Congress can just pick it apart. But so, I have questions about how we're going to pursue any sort of regional trade agreement when we don't have Trade Promotion Authority and when we don't see the Biden administration seeking Trade Promotion Authority. But I think one clue that can be found is in the phase one agreement, which is not a trade agreement, not in the traditional sense. It's an executive agreement. It did not get congressional approval. And when Ambassador Lighthizer was pushed on this during the Trump administration, he referenced Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which of course is also the basis for the tariffs that we are still dealing with, and claimed that Section 301 allows the president to engage in these sort of negotiations without congressional approval. And that, from what I can tell, is pretty boundless in terms of the limits of that assertion. So I guess I have to ask, is the Biden administration, which we know has every intention of hanging on to the 301 tools for its toolbox of things that it can use to manage the trade relationship, is its intention to start pursuing trade agreements that are unofficial trade agreements that don't involve Congress? How is Congress going to react to that? And how ambitious can its pursuit of trade agreements be when it is trying to leverage this interpretation of Section 301 instead of sticking to a more traditional reading of the constitutional powers of Congress? Is it going to mean that we're going to get ambitious trade agreements from the Biden administration, whether with China or to counter China in the region, or is it going to mean that we're going to get weak ones because of the prospect for Congress to revise the Trade Act and take away some of the powers delegated to the president? I don't know the answer to that, but I think we should all be watching. And I think that gets to what's going to happen post phase one. I would just say 301 was invoked to get us to phase one, but phase one didn't actually address most of the issues that were the subject of the 301 investigation. Those issues all remain on the table and need to be addressed, need to be contended with, need to be part of a bilateral dialogue. I hope that we're going to get there, but I am not super optimistic right this moment.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add, I totally agree with everything Anna said here, is that the topics that were chosen, to be put on the table there were not really well thought out, and were not part of a really well thought out strategy. And as I mentioned, the issues like cloud services and data and all these things were sort of, in some ways afterthoughts. They weren't really a core part of the negotiation. So a revamped phase two, sort of on steroids, that takes into account these issues that companies and countries in Asia, for example, really care about. And you know, it's sort of shocking that we don't have any strategy or vision going forward on particularly just the issue of digital trade and digital economy in Asia. And in the meantime, of course, China is stepping in and putting forward its own proposals here, and the U.S. is glaringly absent from the playing field.
Thanks, Anna and Paul. For Professor Teng, I guess the question is related to U.S. China declaration and COP26. We have one audience who say it's just a piece of paper. Is U.S. China collaboration is going to be more parallel rather than really coordinated and cooperative arrangement? One will the working group, climate change working group between U.S. and China is going to establish. And particularly, I think in terms of technology sharing, you talk about emerging technologies, given what we discussed today, in this zero-sum, rivalry kind of context, will U.S. really share technology, or, will China share technology on the climate change side?
Yes, thank you. I will be brief. I think that, yes, it is paper, but it's also a starting point that for the two countries to work together, and especially on the technology issues. I think that the energy and the climate technology, which might be different from other technology in information technology or data or communication technology. I think that in the climate technology, the two countries has less areas for confrontation, because of most of those technologies are not related to national security, and which allow those two countries have the space to work together. For example, I will mention the CCS technology, which China and US in fact already work on these areas for many years in previous decades. And China right now is very close to some commercial demonstration of the CCS project, just in the released 1+N, which is a roadmap for China to achieve its carbon neutrality target. And China is considering that to pilot the CCS project that around 2030. So that gave opportunity that for China and the US to continue their cooperation on those climate technology at this moment. And also would like to mention that we consider the possible cooperation on climate change from two dimensions. One is the possible political risk. Another is the possible shared benefit in those two countries. I think that we can identify some areas which has low political risk but high benefit for cooperation. I think those areas we should work together to identify, and that will be the starting point for those two countries to work together on the technology to resolve this climate change crisis and challenge.
Thanks, Denis. I guess there are also a couple of questions for you. One is, realistically speaking, do you think Kunshan University and NYU, they're going to be in China, or there will be enough pressure from the U.S. government or Congress that these two very good examples of U.S.-China education cooperation is going to end? Number two is the China initiative. Will that drive many Chinese American researchers, out of U.S. or out of a job? And finally, the question about, because of the U.S. concern about technology and how they're going to be applied by China to the military, how U.S. realistically can work with China on this kind of scientific and technology research.
Okay. The first question about the future of JV universities, I actually have not seen any indication that either the Chinese government or the U.S. government wants to end these types of cooperation. I think if anyone has any insight into the future, the best bet we have for working together is starting to get our young people as students to get to know one another, understand one another, and to build bridges that somewhere later in their career they might call upon to work together in a more effective, efficient kind of way. And don't forget, NYU, Shanghai, NYU, and Duke are private universities, so they, we don't work like the Ministry of Education works with Chinese universities. It would be very hard for the government, U.S. government, to force us, those universities, to extricate themselves from China. So I don't think that's very likely. We're always looking for, the possibility of a red line, and the red line has to do primarily with academic freedom, and of course. The academic freedom issue is not just, as I mentioned the other day, is not just a political issue. It has to do with accreditation. That since they give a Duke degree or an NYU degree at these institutions, if they don't maintain the same level of academic environment, academic freedom, academic openness, then they could not justify giving the same degree. So that's really the main push behind that. The China initiative, I think, is a very dangerous initiative. And I have many close friends who are Chinese American scientists. And I'd say over the last 6 months, at least a dozen of them across many U.S. universities have asked me privately, what do I think? Is it going to get worse? They feel the hostility. They feel the suspicion. And I think that we have gone in an excessive direction in pursuing what might be one or two bad apples in the barrel. We're ready to throw the whole barrel away. And they say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, we have a possibility of doing that. Now, I would just tell you that many of the Chinese scientists who have talked to me have not necessarily talked about only going back to China. They're also looking for third countries. A friend of mine talked about going to Saudi Arabia or one of the universities in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi or other places. And he's looking for the opportunity to make sure he can continue to work with both Chinese scientists and American scientists. And what they're afraid of is simply going back to China is that they will lose their connectivity to the American scientific community. So there's lots of considerations that are going on among these people. But there is a certain amount of anxiety that's been built up, and I think that it's very real, and I hope we can figure out a way how to step back from that. What was the third question?
The research, the joint research on any of them.
Right. Okay. So, I think, Paul makes a very good point. That it's not about a zero-sum win or lose game. But even he has just made mention in certain areas we see a certain assertive posture by China to influence and shape the direction of international science and technology affairs. And that's something that we had not seen before. China has gone from being a passive peripheral player to now being part of the mainstream and shaping the rules of the game. Part of the fact is that we need to recognize that if we're going to revise export controls, or we're going to develop something, a new COCOM or something like that, whether or not we need that or not, the reality is that we're going to have to get the Chinese at the table to agree that, you're in for a penny, in for a pound. If you're going to play the game, okay, these are the rules of the game. I think that every agreement that we've signed with China in the late 70s, early 80s is based on the notion that China is a poor, backward country. China is no longer a poor, backward country. And so therefore, the new agreements and new umbrella that I'm talking about putting together has to reflect the fact that we're dealing with a new China, and therefore impose on the Chinese as well as us a new set of requirements and obligations that reflect some of these risks that people are concerned about.
Paul, you in your remarks you mentioned about how Huawei and ZTE are treated. Is it your belief that regardless how many U.S. suppliers ZTE has or how many U.S. suppliers Huawei has, the U.S. government basically is pursuing a strategy to literally destroy Huawei at least? Is that the case? It just doesn't matter what kind of difference Huawei is making here and also elsewhere. The second is what you also mentioned, and there's a question on data. that China has just passed a data law. EU has a data law. US does not have a data law. So, how this data thing, if you are managing US China trade negotiation, as so how this data issue, for example, Tesla, Chinese government tells Tesla that you cannot transfer data out of China, right? There's also the TikTok, the data here, the Chinese company collects, how these issues are going to be navigated, that the two governments and then the corporate side can reach an agreement that, they're all going to follow a set of rules so that they're never going to be worried about data at all.
Great questions, and difficult answer in 2 minutes. On the Huawei issue, it's a complicated issue. If you talk to folks in the Trump era administration, senior people, you got 7 different answers as to why Huawei was put on the NA list. Okay, so there was clearly no strategy, and that resulted in a situation where the officials at the Commerce Department issuing licenses to U.S. companies that were eager to supply Huawei they didn't know what the issue was. They weren't sure which parts of Huawei's business that were the concern of national security. So that led to licenses being denied for things that were clearly for just the consumer part of Huawei's business, for example. It wasn't until late in the Trump era and early in the Biden administration that finally some guidance was issued to the Commerce Department about what to license. So the effect of that was huge, because a lot of U.S. companies were exporting a lot of sort of commodity semiconductors to Huawei, and the argument that the semiconductor industry itself makes all the time is that the China is a critical market for U.S. companies to maintain access to, in part because they derive a lot of revenue that they plow back into R&D to innovate in the U.S. and the U.S. benefits, and that's actually a national security issue for the U.S. Right? But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I mentioned that the strategy in that arena over export controls and the semiconductor industry more broadly has never really been articulated by a senior U.S. government official as sort of to the effect of what's the strategy here. The National Security Committee on AI earlier this year, that was chaired by Eric Schmidt, who also wrote that editorial that Denis mentioned earlier, they actually made a recommendation that a senior U.S. government official articulate what the U.S. policy was with regard to semiconductors and national security concerns around that, right? So that's the problem. So Huawei has been sort of considered an issue for the U.S. government going back to Congress in 2012. But when it came to actually taking action against Huawei, those actions use these older tools like export controls, not really designed to solve great power competition or other issues. And Huawei ended up, of course, the end result, which we predicted 2 years ago to clients, was that Huawei's business model would be basically undermined to the point where they couldn't function as a supplier of 5G handsets or base stations. The data issue now is much more complicated because, as you rightly point out, we've seen China, for example, put in place probably one of the world's most comprehensive data regimes just over the last year, with the data security law, the personal information protection law, measures around outbound data flows that are still the subject of implementing regulations. But at the same time, the U.S. doesn't have a data security law, for example, and you have the EU, some of the Chinese data regulations model on the EU, but clearly with Chinese characteristics. I think that the bottom line is that at least initially, that China's data regime is focused on Chinese companies, right, and getting a handle on sort of how Chinese companies are handling data, both domestically and sending data abroad. And then eventually, of course, U.S. companies and foreign companies operating in China already are having to try to understand how China is going to implement and enforce this very comprehensive data regime, whether data localization is going to be enforced here. And then Tesla, of course, is collecting a lot of potentially personal and important and core data as a result of the 6 cameras that it uses in its car. So all of these issues are very complicated and have emerged since the promulgation of the original cybersecurity law in 2016, which did have a provision in there for data localization, for example. and reviews of cross-border data transfers. But now we're sort of at the point where China is implementing laws and regulations to really put in place this data governance regime. But it's complicated. When I talk to Chinese officials, they claim that the data regime they're putting in place, for example, is flexible enough to comply with CPTPP provisions around data, which have very strict limitations on things like data localization. So if we're going to take China's provision, their application to CPTPP seriously, and their claims that their data regulations, for example, are potentially could be flexible enough to comply with those very strict standards around data, then let's talk about that, right? But again, these are issues that are complicated and require the right set of officials to discuss them. And at this point, there's no bilateral discussions around this really critical issue of data, and I think that's a problem, because again, the economy is driven by digital trade and data, and that's where countries and companies in Asia and elsewhere, this is what they care about, and they don't really want to see a world where China has one data regime, EU has another data regime, and the US has another data regime, and India has another one. That's not a recipe for that globalization that I think David Firestein foot stomped earlier. And so I think that's an example of an area that's, I think, that needs to have government-to-government attention in a very long-term and sophisticated way with a real strategy, and we haven't seen that so far. At least on the U.S. side.
I think our panel, according to the schedule, is drawing to an end. Before I'm going to invite Hong Nong to come over to conclude, I just have one quick question, maybe for any of the four, if you would like to answer. When TPP was negotiated, most Chinese government officials and scholars see that as a conspiracy to contain China. And then, it was completed actually in my city in Atlanta, but then, President Trump withdrew from it. And then the other countries formed the CPTPP. Now, China applied to join. I thought, this is where US and China, because CPP does have very high standard, in terms of human rights, in terms of labor rights, in terms of climate, in terms of environment. Is this realistically a place for US and China to both look into it, and hopefully the two countries can join CPTPP and start really a new play on possible collaboration? Maybe just quickly, Paul and Anna, if you're still there.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that there's obviously we're in a very difficult situation politically, but I think as some of the previous panelists in the first session talked about, I mean, we've dug a big hole. The challenge is sort of getting back to some level of trust in the relationship, where you could start to think about talking about these complicated issues like trade, digital trade, things like CPTPP. I mean, obviously domestic forces on both sides are going to make this very difficult. There's just no appetite, for example, in the U.S. Congress to consider a complicated trade agreement. And there also is that attitude that Anna mentioned earlier, the sort of anti-business bent of the administration, which doesn't want to negotiate trade deals to make the world safer for Goldman Sachs and U.S. technology companies. So we're sort of at a tricky juncture here, where the world and the business community is running headlong forward and continuing on sort of a path to globalization and counting on things like freer cross-border data flows. But there's just no movement to sort of tackle those issues in two of the biggest markets that are critical to this. And so we're sort of left with a sort of WTO situation, WTO that's not really functioning in the data digital economy area, because it really wasn't designed for that. So it's like we need a new world data organization, as my boss Ian Bremmer has proposed last year. But we're sort of unable to at least begin a dialogue on some of these tough issues. And even areas like climate change, why is there, why is it so hard to start up a working group on climate change when, as I think Michael Swain rightly pointed out, these transnational issues like climate change and the pandemic are also very threatening to national security of both countries. So I think, and hopefully in 2022 we can, there'll be some ability to sort of get back to a situation where some of these really complicated issues, which have gotten only more complicated, right? We're on the verge of 5G and AI being deployed everywhere. So issues around data in particular are going to get even more complicated. And in the meantime, in the absence of sort of U.S. leadership on this, for example, you're seeing a lot of regional sort of plurilateral agreements, the RCEP and DEPA, and then of course China and Taiwan both applying to join CPTPP. Because in Asia, I think that that countries get this issue and want to make progress on this, despite the lack again of U.S. leadership, which most countries continue to look to the U.S. for leadership on this issue.
Thanks. I want to thank all our speakers. For Professor Teng, it's really getting late in China, so we're going to invite Dr. Hongnong to conclude today's webinar workshop hybrid. Basically, we hope to hear something on how are we going to pull ourselves of the holes that both Americans and Chinese have done.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Liu. And thank you to all panelists for your great contribution to the discussion. I certainly learned a lot on a variety of issues that we just heard, which features both problematic, but we also see some hopeful cooperation in the future. It's really late right now. It's 1 p.m. here in Washington and 2 a.m. in China. I don't intend to hold you long for a long summary, but we are going to publish a summary and post it on our website, and then we'll share with you later. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank you all to our speakers for spending time with us and sharing your expertise, and also particularly taking a lot of critical questions for the audience, critical but we cannot avoid. And I also like to thank all the online participants around the world who have to stay very late or wake up very early for the west coast of Canada and the US for spending time with us. And then I would like to thank our co-organizers, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies and the China Program, Encounter Center, and also the China Forum, CIS, as Tsinghua University, and who has been working with us for a lot of our events. And certainly I want to thank all my colleagues here in ICAS who are working very hard to make this hybrid format happen. And ICAS will continue our research on these dynamic in the U.S.-China relations to promote greater mutual understanding through exchange of fresh ideas and also adaptive policy orientation, research, and fair assessment of these critical bilateral relations. And we certainly will continue to fulfill our aim to provide a window into this worldview on these bilateral relations and serve as a vehicle to promote greater understanding between the two countries and society and academics. So before I let you, can I invite all our speakers to turn on your camera so that we can take a virtual group photos together. Okay, I think we are good. 1, 2, 3. Thank you all. I hope to see you again in our future events, whether it's in format of hybrid or in person. Hopefully soon in the future we can resume to full in-person conference in the future. I look forward to meeting you again in our future events and certainly our next annual conference. Thank you again to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Wonderful session. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David.